Tuhia ki te rangi, tuhia ki te whenua, tuhia ki te ngākau o te tangata. Ia te mea nui o te ao ko te aroha. Ko te aroha o te atu e tutune a tātou katoa tihei mauri ora. Kia koutou e te hunga e matakitaki mai nei, nau mai, hara mai, whakatau mai koutou. Kei te mihi atu kia koutou no enei ngā maunga whakahi o tāmai ki makaurau, ki o maunga whakahi. Te mihi ki atu kia koutou, nau mai hara mai ki te karanga o te kaupapa o te rā. Nau mai hara mai ki tēnei kaupapa rongonui. He wā whakamaumaharatanga ki te waka rā a te toa a uinuku. Nau mai hara mai koutou, nō reira. Kia koutou e aku rangatire ngā kai kōrero, kei te mihi atu kia koutou. Mauria mai o koutou wairua, o koutou pūkenga, o koutou mahi rangatira, kei wangani a tātou. Mauria mai o koutou māramatanga, kia mātou I tēnei te wā, a pauri te wā hari hoki. Reira, kei te mihi atu kia koutou e aku rangatira. Anō reira, tēnā rā koutou katoa. A ko waiau, a ko hikirangi te maunga, ko waipu te aua, ko ngātikau te iwi, ko hurini kā ahau. A ko au te kaiarehi mo te kura tangata I te whare wānanga o tāmaki makaurau. Reira, tēnā koutou katoa. It's a pleasure and an honour to welcome all our viewers, all our participants, and in particular our speakers to this session this morning. From the proud mountains of this region of Tāmaki Makaurau, we welcome you all we welcome your proud mountains as we gather in remembrance and thought, as we remember the sad events of 35 years ago and its meaning, as we gather for wisdom, for truth, and for justice. It's my pleasure on behalf of the University of Auckland, on behalf of the Faculty of Arts, to welcome you all this morning to this place, to this important kōrero, to this time of sharing and reflection. And I'll end our welcome this morning by singing a waiata from our local mana whenua iwi, from our tribe here in Auckland, He aha te hau. It was a vision of that iwi of a giant ship coming into the Waitemata Harbour here in Tāmaki Makaurau in Auckland. It was foreseeing the arrival of settlers, which was at the time seen as a good thing. That might have changed a little later on. But it is the arrival of a ship and a vision that I think is appropriate. He aha te hau e wara mai. He tiu he rā ki nāna iamai te pūpū taraki hiki yuta. E tiki nā tu e au te kotu. Hoi a te pau whakairo katu. Ki wai te mata I o ku wairangi e kōkiri. Nō reira, I aku rangatira e te hunga matakitaki mai ana. Tēnā koutou, tēnā rā koutou katoa. Greetings.
Te atua manahope e te tumunui e, te haamai tēnei mātou ia oe. No te I rurura tā mātou I putuputu nei e, I te I poi, I te I awatea, I te I hahi, I te I pou. Hau mātou a vovau ai tō mātou manao. Te mānao na nei mātou, I te whea I wharu e mai I te ao, o te haere, o te rewa, o te hoi atu I hawa I nui. Te tere rā hope a mā ohi. Te iroto I torima tō rato wārua, e a pāruru o I a rātou. Te haa māruru nei mātou, I tō mātou mauwheti I Māori, I ao te aroa nui, o te I whaari mai te I putuputura ā. A rata I oe I tā mātou wawau rā parau, ai tau I rā mana o, ini ai hoi te I tau rā parau, o te totoa rā hia I te pahi, Rainbow Warrior, tō ruaharu mā pēra matahiti I te I nei, e te mau paura atomi, o tā te hau wharani, I rawe I roto I a mā ohi nui.
You can go ahead, Ena.
Āwha I te mai oe I te whā, o tā mātou e tano I a tūtawa. Ia mahemo mai te parau tano, te parau mau, I roto I te iamira, mā te au ato anei. Te haamaru ne mātou ia Roxanne Panchasi, wahine e ia David Smith tāne, i naha nā raua hoi i haamanuia i te irurura, i ni ai te tahua na tirara. A whari mai oe i te manihini, o te ape i mai i te irurura, o ia hoi i Oscar Temaru tāne, o Stephanie Mills wahine, o Rebecca Priestley wahine, o David Robie tāne, e teie tawini o vau Ena Manuireva. A wharo mai, i naha te ia oera hoi te mana e te aroha. Greetings to everyone and anyone who are listening. I have finished our karakia, our prayer for this meeting. I give it on to you, Roxanne.
The Marshall Islands were the home of the U.S. atmospheric nuclear testing. And a group of people on Wrangell had been exposed to the biggest test of all, a bomb that was 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima. Over the ensuing 25 years that they were living there, they experienced worse and worse health situation. So they got to the point where they asked to be moved. They asked their own government, they asked the U.S. government. And when we went out there in '85, they also asked us if we wouldn't help move them off the island. To take part in that Wrangell action was just an amazing thing. I mean, it just dwarfed anything else the crew was going through. I was in my bed asleep when the bomb went off. I didn't really realize what it was. I just woke up. And I thought we'd been in a collision with another boat at sea. So I looked out my forward porthole and I saw the lights of Marsden Wharf and thought, well, okay, it's not my fault. I got up and everything was upside down in my cabin. I could see water, about 1 meter below the main deck level. I had no idea what that could be. I figured somebody left a tap running is really what went through my mind. And that's when the second bomb went off. And it went off right under our feet. And I thought, okay, it's time to go. So I walked back aft, calling out abandoned ship, trying to look into cabins as I passed them. Went outside on the casting deck, crawled up onto the dock, stood there looking at the boat with all these bubbles coming up out of it and thing. And that's when Davey Edward, the chief engineer, came up to me and said, well, Fernando's down there. And I remember arguing with him about it, thinking, oh, come on, Fernando's gone into town. That's what he always did. It was a surprise to find out the French did it, and at the same time, it was a confirmation that what we were doing mattered. About 2 days later, we had a memorial service for Fernando. It wasn't until that we had to lift that casket up, I had to lift that casket up with several others and carry it out, that it all came crashing down, and all of a sudden I realized that inside this big box was this dead friend. And it was very real and very final.
Welcome everyone to this roundtable session marking the 35th anniversary of the bombing of the Greenpeace vessel Rainbow Warrior in Auckland Harbor on July 10th, 1985. My name is Roxanne Panchasi, and I'm an associate professor of history at Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining this virtual session from the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I am a settler, an uninvited guest on this territory. I stand in solidarity with efforts to acknowledge its centuries-long history and to defend it and the peoples indigenous to them against further harm, violence, and exploitation. I want to thank Hirini and Ena for opening our session properly and for connecting us to the peoples in New Zealand and in the Pacific today. Whatever else we might talk about today, we cannot lose sight of the people and lands most affected by this history that is a history of colonialism at its very heart. I want to thank the organizers of this meeting of the Society for French Historical Studies, the University of Auckland, and its Europe Institute, which is a co-sponsor of this session, and Massey University, which is co-hosting the conference as a whole. And I want to give a special shout out to David Smith and the team from Age France that's running the show behind the scenes. It's an awful lot of work and I'm very grateful. Finally, I want to extend an enormous thank you to everyone in the audience who is listening or tuning in from various places and different time zones. And this includes people from many regions of the world. And I'd like to extend a special welcome to those who may be joining us from Tahiti or other areas most affected by French nuclear testing. The victims of testing should never be far from our minds today. While I had hoped originally to be in Auckland, gathered in person with our panelists and others, it is a great privilege and honor to be your host on this alternate platform. And I'm excited that this discussion may be accessible in some ways to people who wouldn't have otherwise been able to attend or to join us because of the way that we're doing this now. So let me just start by saying a few words about how things are going to work for the next hour and a half about. I will be moderating this session, including 4 wonderful panelists who are all based in New Zealand, and I'll introduce them in a minute. A few moments ago, we shared a short video that was produced by Greenpeace New Zealand, just to kind of situate us visually, quickly in relationship to the French state-ordered bombing of the Rainbow Warrior that took place in Auckland Harbor on July 10th, 1985. And this session was originally going to take place in Auckland on July 10th. It was a bombing that resulted in the death of Fernando Pereira, a photographer working with Greenpeace who was on the vessel at the time. Over the course of the next 40 minutes or so, I will pose a series of questions to our panelists, beginning with one of them for each question and leaving time for others to add their thoughts and comments. After these rounds of discussion, we will open things up for Q&A with the audience. So throughout the session, we encourage those of you in the audience to post your questions to the chat using the chat function and addressing these to the host, which is H France. Private chat for this session has been disabled. And when you pose your question, and you can do this at any time during the session, it won't disrupt us as we're speaking, the panelists and I. When you post your question, just please indicate whether you'd like to appear on camera to pose the question during Q&A or whether you'd like to have your question read instead. And if there are any other concerns that you have during the session, please just send a message to H France in the chat. So with the exception of those who are posing their questions on camera, when they are called on to do so, we would just ask that audience members keep their video cameras off and their sound muted for the duration of the session. While I'll be acting as your moderator today, I am also a historian of modern France and empire who works on the history of French nuclear weapons and testing, first in the Algerian Sahara beginning in 1960, and then in the Pacific from 1966 into the mid-1990s, with, of course, legacies that continue into the present. The idea for this session came to me soon after I learned that SFHS would be holding its annual conference in Auckland in 2020. At the time, I thought, what an amazing opportunity to revisit this history that connects New Zealand and France to one another, but also to the peoples of the Pacific region and to more global concerns as well. So I reached out to a few people and through a sort of chain of emails and contacts was fortunate enough to secure the participation of our wonderful panelists. And I'd like to introduce them now. Ena Manuireva is a doctoral candidate at the Auckland University of Technology and a Tahitian cultural coordinator who was born in Mangareva, the smallest archipelago in Maunui, French Polynesia as it's known. Ena has relatives who have died from or are coping with cancer of the thyroid, the biggest concern for the local population in the area of France's nuclear tests. Stephanie Mills is Director of Campaigns at NZEI Te Ria Roa, New Zealand's largest education union. She worked in the 1990s as Greenpeace's Pacific nuclear test ban. Nuclear test ban campaigner until France declared an end to testing at Mururoa in 1995. Stephanie has since worked on as Greenpeace's International Nuclear and Disarmament Coordinator and most recently chaired the board of Greenpeace New Zealand, Aotearoa. Rebecca Priestley is Associate Professor at the Centre for Science and Society at the Victoria University, Wellington in New Zealand. She has published widely in the history of science and science communication, with an emphasis on climate change, sea level rise, and nuclear power. Her latest book is titled Antarctica, 15 Million Years in Antarctica, and it was published by Victoria University Press in 2019. David Robie is a professor of communication studies and Pacific journalism and director of the Pacific Media Center in the School of Communication Studies at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. A journalist of more than 40 years, he has reported on post-colonial coups, Indigenous struggles for independence, and environmental and developmental issues. Professor Robie has authored several books on the Pacific region, including Eyes of Fire, The Last Voyage of the Rainbow Warrior. Originally published in 1986, the book's 30th anniversary edition appeared in 2015. He was on board the ship as a journalist for almost, the Rainbow Warrior, as a journalist for almost 11 weeks leading up to the bombing in 1985. So welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'd like to begin with the first question. I'd like to begin with Ena. Thank you so much again for the Tahitian beginning of our session. Whatever else we might speak about today, we need to keep our sort of attention and our thoughts on the fact that the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior was an incident connected to a long and harmful history of French nuclear testing in the region that dates back to the mid-1960s, with tests finally ending in the mid-1990s, as I said earlier, but with legacies, of course, that continue up to the present. So Ena, your personal and family relationship to this history as someone, you know, who's from the place, I wonder if you could get us started with connecting us to this place and to the people that you have family and other connections to who were affected by French nuclear testing.
Thank you very much, Roxanne, for this introduction. My connection with the nuclear testing by the French is very, very close to my family. My sister, just before me, was born with difficulty with her bones. She couldn't stand. She only crawls, you know, for at least a year and a half, and started walking when she was 2. So that was quite. That's why it became very. It is very personal. On the other matter, my mother, who was on the island with my 3 other siblings, and my dad, they witnessed the very first nuclear test in 1966, and they were outside, they were working. My dad was a fisherman and a pearl diver, so they were all doing the work. They were told that there will be something happening, but they weren't aware of when and what are the measures of safety that were or not were given to them. So they were still outside. They saw this big mushroom. They went outside to see what was happening. And that is when some months later, my mom was telling me that they just carry on with business as usual. They weren't told about the danger. They were told that it was clean. The nuclear tests in Mangareva, at least on Morurua and Whangatauwha, were clean. So they did believe the authorities over there. The church played a huge role in keeping the population in the know, but I suspect they didn't know much either, even though it was the French missionary. The administration, the mayor at the time, Tepano, was not briefed either about what was going to happen or when. They knew that something was coming, but they didn't know when. And it's only, my mom was poisoned with the eating the same, they went on the same diet. Our diet is based on fish and also what grows from the soil in Mangareva. So they all kept the same diet, and my mom had her lips bleeding because of the poison of the fallout, I guess, and which is the reason why we had to move we have to move to Tahiti from Mangareva when I was a year and a half. So it was for that reason my mom and my dad were very worried about what could happen to their children. And this is it. We grew up in Tahiti. I have go back to, as you said in the introduction, I have been back to Mangareva since the age of 10, 11, go and see some relatives who were at the time healthy, if you want, but now a lot of them have died, and the most spread disease there was the thyroid cancer amongst women. So I have witnessed as well some of the way the population was treated in Mangareva. I think I sent you a picture about the depot where the population had to find shelter there, and next to it you have the bunker for the military. So that's my connection. That's how close I am to this experience, and obviously I have lived through it. My other two siblings after me are healthy, so this is my connection with this topic of today. And I was just wondering, maybe we could have asked Oscar Temaru to come on, because he was the one who spearheaded this movement, this whole movement since 1977, I think. So 50 years of the same fight. So hopefully we can have him, intervening. Thank you.
Welcome, Oscar.
Yes, hello everyone. It's good to see you. And I would like to say first of all to Stephanie, if we meet on the street of Auckland, I won't recognize you with your new hair dressing, the white hair. Same for David. All those years. That was 35 years ago. Time flies, eh? Oh boy. How are you, Stephanie? Good, very good. Hey, I'm looking for some photos, when we've been to Here Tue with David McTaggart. Remember David McTaggart? He passed away now. I would like to have some of those photos as souvenir. Well, come back to the Rainbow Warrior. Yeah, it was just like yesterday. I don't know if Stephanie remembered that story. We were supposed to go on board on the Rainbow Warrior. The Rainbow Warrior was supposed to come to the Cook Island. Remember that, Stephanie? And we were supposed to fly to the Cook Island and go on board, and from there sail to Moruroa to stop one of the French nuclear testing. That was in 1985. And just at the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior, I received a text from Stephanie saying that the boat was bombed by, they don't know who, but right away I told her it has been done by the French. I was sure. We've been dealing with the French for years. So I knew right away it was done by the French. I've been to Algeria by the year 1960. And we start, demonstrating against the French nuclear testing from our elders, our tupuna. In the 60s, we were young and the church people. And we used to demonstrate every first week of March. After the PCC Conference of Churches, the one that was held on Ponape Island. And it was decided just to remember what has happened on the Bikini Atoll, Kwajalein Atoll, the Marshall Islands. So every week of March from 1938 for 30 years till the last when Jacques Chirac decided to resume nuclear testing on the atoll of Moruroa. That was 1995. And it's a very long story. So that's why I would like to send you a paper. It's not finalized yet, but we'll send you that paper, remind what happened, all those years. And what Ena just said, the same problem, happened not only on the Gambier Islands. Gambia is one of the closest islands to Moruroa. And when they, one of the atmospheric tests, I just don't remember what year was that, de Gaulle general, the famous General de Gaulle of France came to Tahiti. He was on Moruroa, and he was supposed to go to the Gambier Island. But when they pushed the button for that nuclear atmospheric test, the wind blew that way on the Gambier Island. And the lady who was a teacher on the Mangareva, who has prepared the room and the bungalow for de Gaulle, was very disappointed because de Gaulle refused to go on the Mangareva because he knew the clouds went that way. The weather forecast was saying that the nuclear radioactive fallout was going on the atoll of Mangareva. So de Gaulle refused to spend the night on the atoll of Moruroa, and the people of Moruroa were just put, of Mangareva, were put in a warehouse.
Yes, they built.
And the military in a blockhouse, a blockhouse built with cement and, irons. It's maybe
thick walls.
2 meters thick for the militaries. But the parents of Ena were put in a very simple warehouse. And, just a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, the French decided to destroy all those, warehouse on every atoll. And I told to the mayor of the Gambier Island, who was at that time Madame Richemont, yes, forgot her name, don't just keep it, don't destroy it. It will be, for the next generation. But unfortunately, she had pressure from the former president of this country, who was Gaston Floss. Destroy it, it's not beautiful. We have to clean the atoll of Mangareva. But, the people of the Gambier Island, our people here, I nearly bury every day people here in my city of Afar is the biggest city in population-wise. And almost every day we bury people dying from different type of cancer and so on. So it's I just wonder sometimes what sin have we done to the French to deserve this kind of treatment? Now we have different cases before the court, because do I still have time to say a few more things about what's happening now? Yes, I still have time.
I think we were going to ask some of the other people on the panel to about this time, about 1985. But if you're able to stay with us, Oscar, I think we'd like to hear more, especially as we think about how we get to the present and, how we think about the future in light of the legacies of these events.
Okay,
are you able to stay with us for a little while?
Yes. I'm at your, yes, no problem.
Okay.
I'm free.
Well, it sounds like you and Stephanie and David know each other. And we've known each other a really long time. So I wonder if I could ask, Stephanie and David to just let us know about their connection to that time 35 years ago and those events. Stephanie, do you want to start?
Thank you, Iorana, Oscar, and Iorana, and kia ora to everyone. As Roxanne said, this is 35 years since the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior, but obviously a longer time since French nuclear testing started. So I think it is appropriate that we remember people from across Te Moananui-a-Kiwa, across the world actually, who have been impacted. So I think also I'd like to acknowledge Fernando Pereira. For Greenpeace, he was not just a photographer and crew member, he was a friend of many people. And his murder by the French state in the form of the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior is something that was a trauma for many people, and for Greenpeace as an organisation that I think we still have as part of our history. On the positive side, he had a legacy of environmental activism that he passed on to his daughter, which has been great. And I think also his photographs are a very important and still very striking record of the impact of testing in the Marshall Islands in particular. I also wanted to remember today Steve Sawyer, who was on the Rainbow Warrior in 1985. He was the campaigner who really drove that campaign. He died almost exactly a year ago today. Oh. He was also on the Rainbow Warrior in 1995 when we went back to Morotoa and when the final round of French tests finished there. And he was a very important person and friend in my life and in many people's. And finally, I also want to remember Marie-Therese and Bent Danielson, who for many activists around the world and for activists in Te Ao Māori were an incredibly important bridge. They amplified what was happening in Tahiti to many other parts of the world, and their book, Poison Rain, was, I think, it's probably dated now in many of its attitudes, but it was a very important, very important in spreading the word. And also finally Roland Oldham from Morotoa e Tātou. I think, as Oscar said, people are still dying and people still need assistance, and there's still a job to do. And he was critical in that. So rest in peace, those people. Their legacy still lives with us. And it's so good to have Oscar here. And I think of Tea, Hershon, Rito, Heros, Parere, Patrick, many other people. My journey from 1985, it probably began before that. My mother was born in the Cook Islands, and so although she's Pākehā, there was always a kind of feeling in our family that we had a wider connection beyond Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I remember postcards of the Free, the first Greenpeace vessel that sailed in the Pacific, on our mantelpiece when I was probably 6 or 7. So I can blame that on my parents. But in 1985, I was actually working as a journalist on the Herald, and remember I think everybody in New Zealand probably remembers what they were doing that night or that next morning. It's become something that that's been part of our history as a country. But of course, it took a long time to get justice for Fernando, and we're still, I guess, in the tail end of that history. So that's really kind of my connection. Yeah. And then I joined Greenpeace and worked for it.
David, you when I introduced you, I said that you were on the vessel and you'd spent time on the Rainbow Warrior. Do you want to say more about your connection to these events as a journalist and your history of connection to the Rainbow Warrior story?
Kia ora tātou, ia manu. Roxanne, thank you very much for that introduction and so on, and I was very delighted to be part of this panel to share these events. And I really would like to give credit to Oscar Temaru because in my early years reporting on French, the politics and pressures on Tahiti, I covered several elections there as well. Oscar was always the inspiration for us. And like Stephanie, I'd like to acknowledge a few people as well. The book Poisoned Rain from Bengton Murray Danielson was mentioned a few moments ago, but I'd like to go back even further, and that was the original book that they did, Mororo Monomoa. And for many of us involved in reporting on environmental issues and French nuclear testing in the Pacific, that was really our Bible, I suppose, in the early years. I'd also like to acknowledge Fernando, who was a friend and on board the Rainbow Warrior. In fact, we had cabins quite close to each other. And also Stephanie mentioned Steve Sawyer as well. Of course, he was such a superb campaigner, very impressive, and it was a pleasure and privilege to be with those on board. Just my own background in being involved was a connection with France that went right back to when I was a 17-year-old. And I went to I was a New Zealand representative at the World Scout Jamboree in Greece. And on that trip, spent some time in France. I was 17 at that stage and vowed that I always go back to France. And in the 70s, I worked for Agence France Presse, the news agency. And ironically, this is when I became interested in our own backyard in the Pacific. It was only then that I became aware of French policies in the region, particularly the sort of repression against the independence movements in both Mahonui and also New Caledonia, the Kanak struggle for independence. So I became aware of those, and then also the nuclear testing, which at that stage didn't really get much, a lot of media coverage in New Zealand at the time. And I remember the first few articles when I was working for AFP, for the Herald, I think it was at the time, and the New Zealand Listener, was actually about the French nuclear testing program. I remember one article that was played across the Listener, Mororo, Atoll of Great Secrets, and that was one of my earlier articles. But how I came to be on the Rainbow Warrior was at the time I was a freelance journalist specialising in Pacific affairs based out of Auckland. Elaine Shaw, who was then the coordinator, big acknowledgement to her and the role she played with Greenpeace in those early years. She was very keen to have a journalist going on board the Rainbow Warrior for this voyage, the Pacific voyage, to Rongelap initially and then going on to Mororo and so on. She approached me and asked if I would actually go. At that stage, Greenpeace had several journalists, but all from the Northern Hemisphere countries, in fact, including 2 journalists from France. And so my role, I joined the Rainbow Warrior in Hawaii and travelled for about 11 weeks, going up to Rongelap, covering the voyage there, and also the 4 voyages from Rongelap Atoll itself down to Majato, which the people have, hearing the story about Mangareva, for example, similar sort of story of Rongelap, how the islanders were dusted with radioactive fallout from the United States test, particularly in 1954, that Castle Bravo massive test involved. And they had a legacy of thyroid problems and illnesses and so on. And so the people of Rongelap decided they were going to move to another atoll. So the Rainbow Warrior came in as a humanitarian voyage to ferry the village from there to Majato, and that took 4 voyages. So it was a pretty momentous occasion, one of the most amazing experiences and moving experiences that I've ever had as a journalist leading up to the bombing. I was with the Rainbow Warrior up until Kiribati, Vanuatu. That was a very heady moment because Vanuatu had just become independent in 1980 and was one of the, Father Walter Lini was one of the great leaders of the independence movements around the Pacific, but also nuclear free. Vanuatu declared itself nuclear free at the time, and then eventually coming back to Auckland. So that's and just I had I sort of decided at the time this was a momentous occasion, the whole voyage. And so during the voyage, while I was reporting for media around the Pacific and so on, I thought this was really important to write a book and a collection of photographs about the experience and so on. And so this was the first version of the Eyes of Fire. And John Miller did this amazing wraparound photograph. He was one of the extraordinary chroniclers of independence issues and nuclear testing and so on in the Pacific as well, and then eventually ended up with this other one, the most recent one, five years ago. But one of the things was quite a big challenge to try and tell the stories very much from a humanitarian point of view, because one of the things, the tragic events of the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior, is there was a lot of focus, particularly in the media in New Zealand, about the bombing, the outrage of the bombing and so on. But it was, to my mind, it was very much the story of the people around the Pacific that have been suffering for decades from nuclear testing, from not only France but US and Britain as well. So that's where my connection came in. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. And I think, yeah, I mean, we talk about this event as something that we're marking the occasion of, the 35th anniversary of, but that it's connected to all of these other things and really alerted people in a particular way to a much longer history, as you say. I want to say one thing first, which was that it was my intention to get you to sign my book, David, but we'll just figure that out another way. I want to bring Rebecca into this conversation. Rebecca, who you've worked on the history of science and technology in New Zealand and elsewhere. And I guess, starting with you to ask the question of, in that sort of bigger picture of the history of science and technology and the history of, I guess, nuclear New Zealand, how would you situate this moment, that moment, July 10th, 1985, as a kind of turning point and important, and what was your connection to these events?
Well, my connection, I was 18 at the time. It was like a week after my 18th birthday, and I was living in Christchurch and training to be a meteorological technician. And I did look in my diary from that time, hoping that, I might have expressed a bit of outrage that I could share here, but it was actually mostly about boys and angsting about what I was going to do with my life. But I do remember following the events on the news and feeling a lot of anger at the French government and also a sense of pride that we were able to apprehend the agents so quickly. And, when you're 18, things are pretty black and white. And French government and France became the bad guys. And, we started boycotting French products and stepping up protests against French nuclear testing. And I do remember back then we called baguettes French sticks, and, we weren't going to have that anymore, and we started calling them Kiwi sticks as a kind of protest. But, the bombing did have an influence on my life. I read a different book, not yours, David, sorry. I read Michael King's The Bombing of the Rainbow Warrior, which came out the next year. And at that time, like most teenagers, I kind of thought the world was heading towards some kind of nuclear Armageddon. Thankfully that didn't play out. But then later, after I'd been to university and I started doing some work for the Institute of Geological and Nuclear Sciences and learned a bit about New Zealand's nuclear history, I saw this kind of disconnect between our nuclear-free identity and this nuclear history that we had. And so that became the focus of my PhD research and the book that followed. So in terms of its situation in New Zealand history, I think that the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior was a really pivotal event. So it helped cement New Zealand's nuclear-free identity. So by this time, July 1985, there was already widespread opposition from the public to French nuclear testing. And just 1 year before, in July 1984, the Labour government had won the general election on their platform of seeking to establish a South Pacific nuclear weapons-free zone. And by the end of that year, most New Zealanders were living in cities or regions that had themselves declared themselves nuclear-free. And so Labour's nuclear-free policy was put to the test in January 1985 when the Americans requested access to New Zealand's ports for the ship, the USS Buchanan. And because of their neither confirm or deny policy about whether or not they carried nuclear weapons, they were refused entry. So the US response to this was they were very angry and excluded New Zealand from ANZUS agreement. And this added fuel to public support for the nuclear-free policy, because we're a small country, but we don't like being told what to do by powerful foreign governments. So the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior by the French government was really a last straw. But I do want to note that this was against quite a complex and nuanced history in relation to things nuclear. And that's really what I've written about in my book, Mad on Radium. So New Zealand had supported the British nuclear testing efforts, also in the Pacific, in the 1950s. But by the 1960s, when France started testing nuclear weapons in the Pacific, we were officially opposed to nuclear testing. So in 1973, there were two New Zealand Navy frigates that had joined a flotilla of ships in protesting at Mororoa. And New Zealanders had been marching in the streets in protest at French nuclear testing, American ship visits. But kind of there's this parallel history in which New Zealand prospected for uranium. We developed plans for a research reactor, a nuclear reactor in Lower Hutt. There were plans for a heavy water plant in Wairaki using geothermal energy. There were plans for a nuclear power station in Auckland to supply the growing demand for power. But for various reasons, and most of them economic rather than ideological, none of these things went ahead. There wasn't enough uranium to mine. Turned out heavy water was easier to acquire from elsewhere. Discovery of the Maui gas field meant that we didn't need nuclear power. So it was in 1987 that the nuclear-free policy was formalised with the passing of the New Zealand Nuclear-Free Zone Disarmament and Arms Control Act. And this widespread opposition to nuclear weapons, whether testing them in the Pacific or carrying them on ships through our water, was kind of able to expand into an antipathy to all things nuclear, including nuclear power. Yeah, and I think, and that pretty much holds today.
Thanks so much, Rebecca. I think in various, I just want to, I'm mindful of the time, so I just want to remind the audience that we welcome your questions. If you want to put them in the chat, in about, somewhere in the next 7 to 10 minutes, we're going to open this up to a broader conversation, question and answer period. So if you have questions and comments that you'd like to put in the chat, and just a reminder that if you do want to come on camera, you let us know. I guess bringing all of you in various ways, one big question is to think about, why it matters to mark this anniversary now. I'm the moderator on this panel, but I wanted to do this and have this conversation with all of you, and then now have the added privilege of having Oscar join our conversation, because I work on the French side of things. And, in terms of the media, the kind of denial of the bombing, and then the kind of scandals that ensued in the French context, the relationship and the kind of perspective on New Zealand, and the history of all sorts of denial of nuclear testing, of France's responsibility to, pay restitution to victims, to even acknowledge victimization, those kinds of things. So I bring that to this conversation. And I guess for me, working on these things, it's always a matter of what matters in the present, and how the history of something like the bombing of the Rainbow Warrior, but the broader history of testing, it's not just a history, it's something that is alive in various ways, either the ways that people's lives continue to be affected in terms of health concerns, the environmental impact, and then it's connected to things that we need to be worrying about in the present that are related in terms of nuclear threat and the longer term legacies of testing. So I guess I'd like to ask you, maybe starting again with Ena and David, since you're sitting in the same frame, when we think about why it's important to mark an anniversary like this 35th anniversary and think about the future, what, and I know we have a clip of your students, David, that we'll share whenever you're ready for that. But yeah, what do you think is the significance of marking these anniversaries, 35 now, and then when that second edition of Eyes of Fire came out, it was the 30th anniversary. What does it mean today to do that, to acknowledge this history?
Well, I think it's critically important to keep the stories alive and to revive them continuously. We did this project about 5 years ago at Auckland University of Technology, involving about 40 journalism students. And we gave them assignment. Basically, it's a living history sort of a assignment where some of the students went and did news stories featuring the various people involved over the years. Some looked at the environmental issues, how they'd moved on over 3 decades since the bombing. And others did studio interviews trying to develop a story and the history of what really happened. And I think one of the things that really amazed us with this, the millennial students really had no real knowledge of the Rainbow Warrior background and the geopolitics that were involved and the whole events that were so incredibly important back in those 1980s. And that was quite extraordinary. That is sort of like this gap in history to a certain degree. And so the response that we got from students was enormously enthusiastic about the project. But I think it's really important for...
Should we show that clip now? Should we share that clip?
Okay, yes, because I think we'll get a little bit of feedback after that. Yeah, good.
Right, we have
Thanks.
a little bit of that. Yeah.
The 30th anniversary of the Rainbow Warrior bombing is approaching. The vessel used for campaigning against nuclear testing was bombed twice and sunk by 2 French operatives in the port of Auckland in 1985. To mark the occasion, journalism and television students from the Auckland University of Technology have started on a storytelling project this week. Journalism major Anya Chong-George is enthusiastic about the task.
One of the things I really love about journalism is that you are constantly learning. So the opportunity to learn and to do something so in depth is really, really exciting. Pretty much we're being put out of our comfort zone and given such an important project. So I think having that opportunity to make a difference, I guess, spread awareness, which I think is definitely one of the main goals as a journalist you could ever have, to inform people.
Anya says getting the chance to meet with some who were on board at the time is valuable.
I think it's one thing to read something from a textbook, to actually seeing them face to face, hearing from them firsthand what the experience is like, how they felt, what happened. I think it's a completely different experience to just reading it.
Also majoring in journalism, Mabel Muller is looking forward to taking part.
I think it's awesome. I think further on in the future, I'd be able to look back and say, oh my gosh, I was part of that 30. Imagine the 50th, and looking back and saying, oh, actually they had a 30th and I was part of it. So yeah, I think it's a really good learning experience, and it's going to be a really good opportunity for us to grow as learning future journalists, I guess.
She says as a Pacific student, this event is also significant.
I think that Pacific people that live in New Zealand have, an influence back home, because, people back home look up at us like, oh, they live in New Zealand, they get all these advantages living there. And so I think it's important for us to be informed so that we could inform them. Yeah, I guess it hasn't personally affected me, but I am from Pacific Islands and was it has something to do with the Pacific Islands. So yeah, I think that makes it all the more important for me to know more about it.
New Zealand is quite a small country, and so for them to stand up against this kind of thing was really, really significant. And I think it's quite important for the Pacific nations to know that they don't have to be, you know, like manipulated or forced into something that they don't believe in.
Both think opportunities like this are important for journalism students to jump into, for experience and to inform others.
For me, it's more about experiencing it and learning and growing as a journalist, and like, okay, that's how that goes. I think if I didn't know this as a journalist, how much more so do other people who don't, you know, who aren't open to like this kind of work and things. And so I think it's really important.
I think also because now, obviously with climate change and all that kind of thing, like environmental issues are such a huge talking point at the moment. So definitely like the next generation should really be aware of this, and I wish I had learned more about it when I was in school. So yeah, it's great to get the opportunity to actually learn now.
All right then. Well, it was a great clip of these two students, and I do want to highlight one moment in it where one of the students, you know, talks about being Pacific and from the region of testing, and how important it is that she was living in New Zealand. You'll know this story better than I do, David, that she was living in New Zealand, but that she's from the region of testing, and she says that participating in this project was especially important to her, I think.
Can I just add something too about I think the contribution that some of the media did over the years, because in New Zealand at the time, we were quite naive, really. This was an act of state terrorism, and the police were caught unprepared, but they did an amazing investigation. But for the media, this was completely out of left field in a way, and as well as the shock that we had at the time, was actually sort of. But I would like to pay a credit to many of the French journalists who actually did a lot of the major investigations, and I think that just very very quickly, you know, that initially it was seen, and the way it was portrayed in media as an underwatergate was a common sort of epithet we used for it at the time, but that later became Blunderwatergate. As it became, you know, more and more revelations came out and showed that there was a pretty inept, you know, operation, in the sense that what hadn't been taken into account by the DGSE was that this is a small nation, as you've, and it's a nation of incredibly inquisitive people, and they notice small details and so on. So the things were exposed fairly quickly. But what, you know, the real breakthrough came in September 1985, when Le Monde, the crime reporter Edwy Plenel, who was mentioned briefly in one of the video clip that you showed right at the beginning, Roxanne, his investigations, he basically sort of produced the smoking gun, if you like, with the official government involvement, and of course it led eventually to rolling heads, with the head of the DGC resigned, and then of course there was also the defence, well, actually the head of the DGC was sacked, Admiral Pierre Lacoste, and then there was the Defence Minister Charles Hurneau that was forced to resign. But it was Plenel that actually sort of broke this story, and then Plenel, many years later, he started this independent investigative website called Mediapart in Paris. And so different stages over the last 3.5 decades or so, there's been new revelations, and it's taken a long time, but more and more layers, if you like, of this incredible story have been peeled back. And it took 20 years later that it was revealed that President Mitterrand was actually had given the green light to the operation in the first place. And then it was also 30 years on, we had the actual bomber, Colonel Jean-Luc Gister, who admitted his role, and he apologised for it. But it's a beautiful quote that I have to share with you. And he said at the time, when he admitted his role, he said, "For us, it was just like using boxing gloves in order to crush a mosquito. It was a disproportionate operation, but we had to obey the order. We were soldiers." And then, of course, Christine Cabon was the woman who infiltrated Greenpeace office in Auckland there. She was tracked down by a couple of French journalists in one of the southwestern local newspapers. And she, once her cover had been blown, of course, her career had ended as a spy. And she'd tried to keep silent all these years, but she eventually spoke out. And so, step by step, the events keep unfolding. And it's really important, I think, to have events such as you have organised, Roxanne, thank you very much, to keep this event alive and to explain to new generations and have new generations involved in the whole geopolitical consequences of this, and particularly for our region.
Well, we're starting to get a couple of questions from the audience, but I wanted to just come back to Stephanie. You know, when we were talking about this and planning, you know, what does it mean to you? I mean, obviously there's this personal connection in terms of the friends and colleagues that you had at the time, but what does it mean to you in terms of your activism and your, you know, investment in some of these questions to commemorate something like this 35 years later?
I'm not really so interested in what it means to me as to how you know, what we do as individuals and collectively changes things. So I suppose my response would be, you know, the campaign against nuclear testing was in Greenpeace's DNA from its start in Vancouver, and the tests that, you know, the first sail up to Amchitka to stop the American tests there. But I think that the campaign in the Pacific was slightly different in that we had to have the mandate of people in Tahiti. And Oscar, again, I just say that was such an important relationship. We could not have been in Tahiti without the blessing, I guess, of Oscar and other people, people like Gabby Tetirahi as well. I mean, there were so many people, but I think that we were quite naive too about the pressure that people in Tahiti were under. And I mean, I think I used to joke about it, but I only had to visit. You know, I'd get met at the airport by various immigration police. I didn't get followed around and have my photo taken. There were you know, I mean, Oscar knows the story. It's like East Germany, eh? You have the Stasi there, just in a different form. And so I think that was a real challenge for us, particularly from Anglophone, Anglo-Saxon countries, in working both in the Pacific with Pacific partners and in an organisation that was global. And I think part of the impact of the bombing actually was that it didn't just bomb the Rainbow Warrior in Auckland, and really sank the Greenpeace office in France for quite a number of years, because of the way the French government portrayed the bombing as almost like Greenpeace's fault, I think, in France. And so it was another kind of trauma. And I remember meeting with people in Greenpeace France several times, every time before we went back to Tahiti, because it was such a big trauma for them. And I mean, I guess what I would say though is that, you know, as Rebecca described, over the decades, the mood shifted, not just in New Zealand and in other countries around the world, but certainly in Tahiti and certainly in France. And so, you know, by 1995, when Chirac resumed testing, just after the world had, you know, tried to renew the non-proliferation treaty and people were trying to get a comprehensive test ban treaty, I mean, there was a majority of people in France opposed to testing. There were, you know, dozens of boats in the Pacific Peace Flotilla, not just from New Zealand, but from Australia, from Chile, the Waka from the Cook Islands. You know, there were people all over the world. There were 5 million people that signed a global petition. So, you know, it was an example of change from the bottom up, from people up. And certainly while Greenpeace was in the limelight because of its role, it wasn't something we did on our own. And I always think about that concept of 1 billion acts of courage, that, you know, no one person, no one organisation can take on these big systems and state interests in the sort of nuclear state without an enormous number of people's efforts. So I guess when I'm talking to students now, because the Rainbow Warrior bombing and the nuclear-free legislation is now a core part of the history curriculum in New Zealand schools. Unfortunately, not everybody does history, but it should probably be taught much earlier. But, you know, my children and their friends are saying, "What happened, Mum? What happened?" And so I think telling that truth, it's more than a story, it's a truth about what happened, is really important, because it's not just about nuclear, it's not just about the bombing of the Warrior, it's about people having agency to make change. And so we didn't win a campaign, we moved power. And I think that kind of analysis is incredibly important if people are going to, you know, I mean, we still operate Greenpeace in the Pacific to some extent, but in some ways that was the high watermark as well. 1995, when we had an office in Fiji, we had people working in Papua New Guinea, and we were working not just on nuclear testing, but on climate change, on fisheries and so on. And so, I mean, I guess my hope would be is that Greenpeace itself can recommit to some of that work and continue to honour the partnerships it's had with people and organisations in the Pacific.
Yeah, that's great, Stephanie. We actually had a couple of questions about that longer context before the 1980s, and another question about the future and, you know, hopes for what Greenpeace might be engaged in into the future. So I think you sort of covered those a little bit, or addressed those in your
you don't have to ask
response there. But we have, I think, someone who's willing to come on screen. A question from, I think it's Lucy Isaacson.
Hello. Yes.
Oh,
hi.
Is it Lucy? Did I get it right? Okay.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Lucy Isaacson from the UK. So I'm involved with getting people ready for climate change risks and understanding what is happening and the impacts of their activities, and to shine a light on positive opportunities now, particularly right now, post-COVID. We know we have to use different ways to bring people on board for that journey. And I think this story is quite a powerful one for some of them. And I just wondered, it's almost feels like a permission asking, but how do the panel feel? And I know we've heard some already, but how do the panel feel about us using the story to shine a light on this wider education, and that things aren't quite what they always seem, even today?
Does anybody want to speak to that? Oscar, did you want to say something about that? Great.
Yes, please. I would like, first of all, to say thank you to Stephanie, to remember Bang and Marie-Therese Danielson, because those people were very strong support for our people down here in Tahiti. And if I can show you this photo, this man is a congressman in the US, and we were arrested together. I don't remember what year was that. This is Eni Manuireva. We put in jail in Moruroa, on Moruroa Atoll. And it was the President, Bill Clinton, sent a fax to the French ambassador in Washington to free him right away, quickly. And in the middle of the night, the admiral, the French admiral, came in jail and tell us, who's that guy, Falio Manuireva? He said, it's me. And well, you follow me, because you're free. We get a message from Bill Clinton from Washington, follow us. And he said, no, I'm not alone. I came with all the other fellows. If you want to free me, you also have to free all those guys. So, yes. So that's why in the middle of the night, the French admiral had to find out a plane to take us back to Tahiti because the roads in Tahiti were blocked. And if I have time, I would like to tell you those two big issues, the French nuclear testing and our freedom, our fight for the freedom for our self-determination are tied up. You know, till now we have the consequences from the decision taken by de Gaulle in 1960s to use Mangareva for the French nuclear testing, you know? And our country, our local people has been hugely impacted by the French army, the French politics, the colonization of our country, and I should say the neo-colonization of our country up until now. And I want to remind you, a couple of years ago, the current president of our country, he made a statement in our parliament saying that we have been lying to the people of French Polynesia for 30 years, saying that the French nuclear testing is harmless, you don't have to worry about anything. And in 2013, to be very short, we succeeded to take our country back on the list of the country to be decolonized at the United Nations. And the United Nations is asking to the French information about nuclear testing that has been done in our country from 1966 to 1996. And there's no answer from the French government up until now. And October the 2nd, 2018, I sued the French government, the former president of France, yes, and the current president, Emmanuel Macron, before the International Court of Justice. And let's say a couple of weeks after, they decided to remove me from our parliament. And now we are before the French court. After tomorrow, we'll be demonstrating before the French court to tell them to respect the decision taken by the United Nations. And we want to be under the justice should be a Tahitian justice, because right now, for years, over 170 years, we are judged on the name of the French people. We want to be judged on the name of the Maori people. That's our fight. And there will be a petition. We will send it to the world so the whole world will know what we are doing. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Robbie. It's nice to see you again. Ena.
Thank you so much, Oscar.
For questions, I'm ready to...
Ena, do you have thoughts on this idea of using this story? I think when we talk about the resolution of some of these things, people talk about money that was paid, to Greenpeace, the acknowledgement, that sort of these indemnities. But of course, if we look at that bigger picture history in terms of the people affected by testing, it's unfinished business.
Yes, it is. Yes, thank you, Roxanne. It is. I'm going to concentrate a bit more on my community, because those are the people who have suffered, have died, and also are still dying because of the nuclear testing. One of the things that you might be shocked to see when you go to Mangareva is when you go to the cemetery, you'll see a lot of babies and children who died up there at the cemetery. So, and also I went there, every time I go there, I did some research. And you start interviewing people, you will notice that, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the women there carry the scars of a cancer of the thyroid. So you talk to them and you'll be surprised to see how many of those mothers, grown mothers, have suffered and are still suffering, going through the physio or chemo, I guess, and having to take their pills. And that's my take on this. Why we have to commemorate. We go to Tahiti because we got a bigger impact from the supporters, starting as well with Temaru, but also with one of our priests, local priest in Mangareva, whom I would like to acknowledge. Carlson, Father Carlson, he's been quite involved in this movement, although he had some pressure from the government, from his church, from his bishop, but he has carried on fighting for justice. That's what he's looking at. He's looking at justice. I would like to go back to what Temaru just said, Oscar, is that our actual French president in Tahiti said, I was a part of this mob. He mentioned himself. He was a part of this mob who have lied to the population for the last 30 years. And it just shows you how much the population that was close to Moruroa, Whakatauwha, Tureia, Marutea, all those people have also suffered. And Mangareva, mostly because it's an island, so the clouds will stop over our island and will pollute and contaminate the environment and the waters around it. One of the things that was quite, for me, poignant is that in Tureia in 66, or 67, I guess, where all the population, all of them, were taken away from Tureia to go to Tahiti to celebrate the July 14th. All of the population, nobody was left on the island. And for that, they said that they could go to Tahiti to celebrate with the French or with the other population the whole of, I think it was for a week they were there, if it's not two. So they were taken back while their country, or their atoll, that is an atoll, was being polluted by the fallout. So you see, there is a way where, to me, I'm closer to my community because of acts that have been perpetrated on that community, on my community, and it has still suffering. We still have people dying from there, or having to go to the medication, but still dying. And that's why we need to commemorate for the babies and for the old people who died from this disease. That is my message to those who are listening to us on this day.
Thank you so much, Ena. Rebecca, do you have thoughts on, the nature of the significance of commemorating this particular event and how it fits into a bigger picture, either in terms of the nuclear history of New Zealand or where things are at now in terms of those commitments? Did you want to add anything to that?
I guess, given that I'm trained in history, I'm going to say that it's always important to acknowledge these past events. And that was a crazy time in New Zealand's history and the Pacific's history. And we're going through a pretty crazy time right now. And I think at a time when we were standing up for what we thought was right, and I think we could even say that was a bit of evidence-based decision-making that we were doing back then and that we're trying to do now. So I think it's I'm coming from a New Zealand perspective when we were standing up and doing something different from the rest of the world, and that's what we've done with COVID as well. So I think it's a good time to sort of talk about other times in the past where we've done that.
Yeah, I was wondering if somebody was going to bring that up, so I'm glad that you did, because we're all watching you all. I think we have another question from someone who's able to come on screen, from Charles Hanna.
Hi, let me just switch it off. Okay, here I am. Hi, this is really a great discussion, and I'm incredibly grateful to all of the panelists and to you, Roxanne, for organizing this. So I'm a New Zealander. I live in Los Angeles. it's interesting. People wonder why a year after Trump became president, a year after his inauguration, that after many years of being eligible for American citizenship, I actually decided to become an American citizen. And my wife, when I got back from the ceremony, posted a photograph of me with my American flag and my certificate of citizenship on her Facebook page, and all of her friends and my friends responded, "Why is a New Zealander wanting to become an American citizen?" Well, you know, what happens in America has a big impact on the rest of the world. And I'm a storyteller. I'm a film and television producer. And I thought that, you know, I need to be here at this pivotal moment in what's happening in America. And then late last year, I saw the LA Times had a supplement about what happened in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and the 50s. And when I talked to all of my American friends, all of whom were very progressive and very liberal, and asked them, did they know about what America had done in the Marshall Islands? Of course, none of them did. I mean, this was very soon after the Second World War, when America and the Marshall Plan that followed the Second World War was beating its chest and saying, look what we have done. We have rid the earth of Nazism. You know, we're great people. And what did they do? They had these nuclear tests on Bikini Atoll. And the story, as I've researched it, has become, it's even worse than I originally thought. Not only did they have the tests on Bikini Atoll, they had taken the people from Rongelap off the island and then brought them back 2 years later. Why? So that they could, as I understand it, so that they could actually research and test the impact of radiation poisoning on these people. Yep. And I came across a documentary made by John Pilger in which he showed some footage of doctors and scientists on the east coast of the United States referring to these people who were being tested as savages. So this is why this connects with the Rainbow Warrior is this. The French, it seemed clear to me that because the Rainbow Warrior had become a sailing ship, as we all know, in Florida just prior to going to Rongelap and prior to heading the plan to go to Mururoa, and the fact that the boat and the crew had taken such profound action, as David was talking about, at Rongelap and in the Marshall Islands, that Unu and Lacoste, they saw, oh my heavens, this is really, there's a great possibility that this is going to go really bad for the French, that the world is going to know about what we're doing in Mururoa because of the Rainbow Warrior. Because if you think about what they did, it was unimaginable. I mean, Auckland is the largest city of a friendly nation. The French have been, I mean, New Zealand forces were involved in the liberation of Europe. And that was not many years before. So for this to happen, there was a level of extreme terror, it seems, on behalf of the French. And it's also clear that the DGSE had a number of failures, including the trying to blow up the Iranian embassy in Beirut, not many years before. So all of these things came together for this terrible, terrible, terrible act. And the only thing that I could say about it, just in summary, is that it's giving us an opportunity, me as a filmmaker, an opportunity to tell a bigger story, a story that's almost too late about environmental struggle, about the environmental struggle we're all in. And so I as tragic as it was for Fernando, and as difficult as it was for all of the crew to lose their shipmate, the Rainbow Warrior in 7 years had an extraordinary life, and there is a great story to be told, and because of this story about the Marshall Islands, I have a sense now that American audiences might be interested in knowing, and the people I do business with, the people who buy the shows that I make, might be interested in this story at this moment. Also, of course, because of COVID and because of the Black Lives Matter protests, all to do with colonialism. I mean, that's really the beginning of the Black Lives Matter protests around the world. So, so there is perhaps, what I'm trying to say is that I'm very inspired by this conversation. I'm very inspired by the opportunity to tell a story about the Rainbow Warrior, not about the bombing, but about, you know, a group of people who came together from all parts of the world and did some truly, truly, truly remarkable things. And maybe to let people know in the United States about America's history in terms of its own nuclear tests. Because I'll just finish with this. Not only did America explode numerous bombs on Bikini Atoll, they also brought, and this is a horrifying piece of history, a lot of the nuclear waste from the tests that had happened in Nevada and buried it in where the bomb had gone off in Bikini Atoll and put a concrete dome over it. Well, what's happening? Climate change has happened. Sea levels are rising, and all of the air is now leaking. I mean, this is horrifying, and this is what's going. And again, I'll finish with this last point. At that time, the Marshall Islands was what was called a U.S. trust territory. Wow, isn't that an astonishing contradiction? Thank you for listening to my long dissertation.
Thank you for coming on camera. It's what you just said is connected to a question that we got from Sri Krishnamurthy about the contemporary challenges for people and territories in the Pacific Islands who are affected by testing. The long-term legacies are there, and we've talked about that and the health consequences, but then yes, also this question of the containment of the materials that were released by tests and whether or not that those materials pose ongoing future threats into the future. So a sort of the idea that there will be another, either slower in time or at a crisis moment, sort of leaking and other kinds of things that will further harm the population and the environment in that area. Does anybody want to say anything about that? Oscar, did you want to say anything about that?
Yes. You know, I just told you in a couple of days we'll be in front of the court of the French court of propriety, because you know, the plan of the French government, they're trying to close Radio Tefana. Radio Tefana is known throughout the world as a nuclear-free radio, you know, and they are also preparing the assassination of the political leader who is in front of you. Yes. And because of his fight against the French nuclear testing and the fight for our self-determination. And I would like to ask Ena about the idea of, you know, to join the movement throughout the world, Black Lives Matter, to add Maori Lives Matter. What do you think about that?
I thoroughly
because
agree
our
with
people
you.
are dying of, because of the French nuclear testing, and the future generation. It's worse than what, you know, it's a kind of racism from the French government.
Yeah, Oscar, I think I'm just talking to David Robie here. We're going to use it as a hashtag. I totally and thoroughly agree with you. It is on behalf of the people, as I said, who are still dying. We need to have a movement that says, you know, we are here to protest about what happened in French Polynesia against our will, that's for sure.
French occupied Polynesia.
French-occupied Polynesia or Maohinui against our will. And this is a movement that we were hoping, David and I, to talk about a bit more, and also trying to make this new generation here in New Zealand, but also all over the world a bit as well. In Tahiti, I know that there is a big movement of young people taking on this new baton, taking on this new project of making themselves present, making their presence felt as new future generation to stand against colonialism, neo-colonialism, as you mentioned it, because it is important. We are, especially the small island like Mangareva, a very small island, where we are very dependent on what's happening in Tahiti or what's happening in France. So we need to join. We need to join this kind of movement, saying that we are here, we are small, but we can put all of Europe within Maohinui. So it's a movement that should be absolutely should be born from out of this conference or the conference to come, in order to make people aware of this movement, this anti-colonialism movement that we are setting up, I guess, David.
Yes, I would like to say thank you to the guy from LA, from the United States. He made his, it's really, that's the truth. That's a great idea. It's the colonial situation of our country. And that's our fight for over 40 years now. So you're right, we have to sensibilize and conscientize the new generation to take up the flag and go forward. And we need the whole world, the support of the international community. That's very true.
Does anyone else want to, Stephanie, did you want to say something?
Well, I think that point, Oscar, about the international community, and it was one of the reasons I mentioned Benton Maritere, is because I think everybody can play a different role in this, in any struggle. But, I think Lucy's question about whether this story can be used to help inspire a new generation of climate activists, I'd say absolutely. I think story is the most important thing we have as humans to express, both the pain of being human and also the hope. So in terms of that global reach, I think, when Oscar mentioned Ena Manuireva from Samoa, Greenpeace is a global organisation, and our crew were always global, but we also always had people from Tahiti, whether it was Oscar or other people on board. And I remember being, when we were tear gassed and boarded in 1995, when we sailed into the test site, and a few of us were left on the Rainbow Warrior and towed to Howe, and we kind of disappeared for 4 or 5 days. And as a result of this panel, I went back and looked in my box of, memories, and there were copies of my father's fax to the French ambassador and the Prime Minister and various other people who'd written on my behalf. But actually, I wasn't really afraid, because I knew about the 5 million people that had signed the petition. I knew that Greenpeace officers around the world would be organising protest actions at every French embassy everywhere. I knew that, I hoped that the Prime Minister Jim Bolger would be doing something on my behalf as a New Zealand citizen. So I think that global reach has been something that Oscar has always put effort into, and I think it's an incredibly, it's not just a strategy, it is because we're connected, right? But it's also a really powerful way of people being able to be allies in a struggle. So yeah, I guess maintaining, telling stories so that people can know and then act to support people is really important. And I think that was one of the successes of the French nuclear testing campaign, from my perspective, was that it did become something that it went from, people who are directly impacted to people in the wider Pacific, the churches, the governments, local communities, to being a nuclear-free Pacific, to being something that was broader through the international legal system and so on. So it took many years, but that's how change happens. It takes a long time. A lot of people.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. And I want to, we're going to need to wind down. Oh, did you want to say something, David? Sorry. You're smaller, so I see you.
Well, just picking up on Stephanie's theme, the storytelling for truth and justice has certainly been a motivating influence that I've had as a journalist over many years, and I do think that the media has enormous responsibility to doing and providing a space for that storytelling for truth and justice and so on. 2 years after my Rainbow Warrior book came out, I was detained twice in New Caledonia by French military, and it was a form of harassment, but it was fairly minor compared with what many people have faced in the independence movements in New Caledonia and Tahiti as well. But it certainly gave me a personal taste of what it means when you're harassed and detained at gunpoint in the first instance. But I wanted to pick up on a statement that Walter Lini has passed on now, but when he's the founding father of Vanuatu, became independent, he said, "We will not have independence just because we have gained independence, in that case, from both France and Britain. We will not have independence until the people of Mahaonui, the Kanak people, and the people of West Papua gain their independence." And I think that's a fundamental critical issue for the whole region, and in terms of even climate change and so on, that fundamental issue is about independence and self-determination for our Indigenous peoples.
Thank you so much, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you, David.
Well, I just want to thank, we're going to wind down now, and I just want to thank all of you for participating in the panel. Rebecca, Stephanie, David, Ena, and Oscar for joining us. It's been really an honor to have you as our special guests today. I also want to just one last time acknowledge Fernando Pereira. We talk about the vessel and we talk about this history, but it's important to keep in mind that this isn't just the memorial of an event or a ship, but of a person whose life was lost, and all of the victims of nuclear testing who are continuing to live with the legacies of these tests. And then, the future, to keep those things in mind, and the future that includes decolonization efforts. I think all of that is very important for us to hold. And I think Ena is going to close our session. Are you ready for that now, Ena?
Yes, Roxanne.
Okay, thank you so much.
Te atua mana haupe, te tumunui, wa tāpē mātou I te hope ara o te wawaura prau, o te ai tawira manao, wa whaaro mātou, ia mātou, nā roto I te ie tahua na tirara, wa horo a mātou I tō mātou manao, wa haere mātou I mua, kia riro o ia te ie rurura. E rurura no te whaia e pohe nei, I roto ia maahunui, o te irohia I te ati, nā roto I te maupaura atomi I rawahia. E haaman o mātou, ia Fernando Pereira o te pohe, o te mate, I te tupitara ahia o te Rainbow Warrior. Ia mana o mātou, haaman o mātou, te mau tamari, te mau pepe o te pohe, nā roto I te mau tupitara atomi, o te ohia I te nā maumai. No reira, e te tumunui e, a paruru o ia rātou, a paruru o ia mātou. Wa riro te irurura e whaai te itara I te nuna ata atua o te ao nei. Te orara, o tō mātou mau whenua, mai te ao Māori, e te ao Māohi. Mā rorurheia o tau, wa o te tatatou rurura ini ai te tahuana tirara, ia mai ta I tato.